People ask me where I first heard of the story of Frank Ryan and why I decided to make it into a film. Well, it's over 20 years ago that I first came across Ryan and his story, and it was in the context of my involvement in various political movements, particularly in the north of Ireland at this time, when there was an attempt to bring together a socialist tradition with the Republican movement. Many of us as socialists had great reservations about the physical force tradition and particularly the militarisation of the conflict. Ryan, with his emphasis on breaking from IRA politics and developing a mass democratic working class organisation around Republican Congress, seemed to be an icon for many of us who sought that alliance, that sort of alignment, realignment between socialist politics and Republican politics. Now, of course, the difficulty was that everybody wanted to talk about Ryan, the radical in Ireland and Republican Congress. Everybody wanted to talk about Ryan, the great hero in the Irish Brigade that joined the Spanish Civil War, but people were less willing to talk about Ryan and his time in Berlin. And indeed, when I first discovered this story of Ryan's collaboration with the Nazis in early 1940s Berlin, it really came as a shock to me that somebody could, of his background, could end up in this particular political situation. And maybe that created the seed, the kernel in my mind, a curiosity about how this enigma could be addressed. And it was 20 years later that I had the opportunity to bring that long-term interest in Ryan into alignment with the possibility of making a film. And of course the film started off from the enigma. What else could it start from?
Colonel Wiesemeyer, perhaps you could be more specific as to what form this collaboration might take.
Of course, Herr Ryan. I know you are a man of action. But first, your pass. We'll get you through any door in Berlin. And before I praise you of our plans, there's someone here I'd like you to meet. I believe you two gentlemen are acquainted.
Russell. General Sean Russell. What on earth are you doing here?
However, the story also has an epic quality, which again is attractive to filmmakers, full of dramatic action. It has a romance in it, but above all, it's an historical sweep which takes us from the Irish Civil War through the Depression of the 30s, through to the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War. 20 years of extraordinary history that Ryan, in some ways, is at the core of in many of his activities. And it's precisely that epic sweep that I think provides the basis for the film, and also the challenges of how you, as a filmmaker working on a fairly modest budget, can address, using dramatic form as well as purely documentary form, the challenge of capturing and representing an historical epic of that proportion. Given the limited resources we had available to us, and this is very much a film within the tradition of a pure Celtic cinema, that's to say, an Irish cinema which doesn't aspire to have the riches of Hollywood and has to behave creatively in how it approaches the story, developing strategies on a low-budget basis to address stories of historical epic proportions such as the Frank Ryan story. And that led me to really work around a strategy I developed over a number of films using archive. We can't restage the Spanish Civil War, we can't restage with the sort of accuracy that an audience would expect the Berlin in the Second World War, Berlin in the 1940s. However, we do have access to a wonderful treasure trove of archive which deals with these periods, and by drawing on that archive, it is possible to set the context and the sensibility of the period for an audience, because after all, this is the most accurate representation you can really get of what it was like during this particular period. However brilliant your set designer might be, however large the budget they have for sets and for design, they can never get the same sense of immediacy and sense of how it really was that archival film can present to an audience. So what we were doing then was searching the archive to find any footage dealing with Ryan, dealing with the 1920s Irish republicanism, dealing with the Spanish Civil War, of course, and later on what life in Nazi Berlin. And then we would design the script to shoot small elements of live action which could interweave with this archive material to produce a fairly seamless narrative, enabling us to drive the story home.
Frank Ryan, Connolly Column, 15th International Brigade.
Make some space for the man. I'm finding my bunk. He's a good one. Though God knows how long he'll be here.
I've heard there's a price on his head. Franco's got it in for him.
One of the key points when the film has been screened is a debate about its historical accuracy. Clearly the expectation with a documentary film is the documentary film should give a factual documentary record-based account of the past. With a film that is a dramatisation, the expectations of audiences are somewhat different. They tend to cede to the director the possibility of bending the record, of using the imagination, and there's a certain suspension of disbelief in the contract with an audience for a drama film that's not there with a documentary film where the expectation is verisimilitude and historical accuracy. When you have a film which is a hybrid film, as this film is, between the documentary form and the dramatic form, then it poses certain questions about how bound you are by the historical record, or on the other hand, how free you can be to interpret your character, the character's actions and motivations, and indeed even interpret the web, the warp and the weft of historical development. Another question I'm often asked is how the script evolved, and in particular how you script a film which is in part documentary and in part has a dramatic and fictional element. Well, I started off reading all the secondary literature, all the books that have been written on the life of Frank Ryan, in which there are now 3 or 4 really quite excellent historical texts. Then I had the opportunity to look at all the archive of this period, the 20s and 30s through to the 40s, drawn from American sources, drawn from German sources, and Irish film archive. Then the opportunity to work with an historian in trying to fashion a script that was true to the facts but could develop a dramatic story to draw in a contemporary audience. So it might be appropriate to talk about the creative treatment that actually emerged rather than just the script. And that creative treatment was based on certain sort of premises that we wanted Ryan, in a sense, to narrate his own story. And really the only way to do that in dramatic terms was through a particular conceit that we developed, that he would tell a story to a young radio producer, Hans Hartmann. Hans Hartmann was there visiting Ryan at Ryan's flat for the purposes of recording Ryan's story on a tape recorder for potential broadcast in a German radio station to Ireland. And this theatrical device, this conceit, allowed the possibility of developing a narration, not of a straightforward documentary sort, but maybe what could be described as a unreliable narrator. We don't know to what extent Ryan's fully telling the truth in the construction that we make, and we create the possibility that he could be telling the absolute truth, or that he could be attempting in some ways to justify his own situation in Berlin in the account that he gives to Hartmann, and the account that he then makes into the tape recorder narrating his own story. When I started to plan the film, I initially assumed that the archive content would be the predominant one, and that the way that we would use the actor's performance was the way that's very often used in documentaries. That is to say, the actors engage in playing out reconstructed scenes, very often with very little dialogue, mainly action sequences, standing in for really the absence of archive within the documentary frame due to historical accidents. There is no archive, or very little archive, for instance, of the 1916 Easter Rebellion, only of the aftermath of it. So if you actually want to give a sense of the immediacy of the events, particularly, say, for instance, inside the GPO, or in our case, if you wanted to give a sense of the immediacy of the events around Republican Congress and the clash with the more traditional IRA, Old Guard, then you really had to engage in reconstruction. When we started to work with the actors, it became obvious this was the idea of just making them mannequins to achieve an archive purpose was a very poor way to use actors. We were gifted with wonderful actors like Dara Devaney, and we were able to get performances which made me revisit the script and reimagine the script.
Call off your Rottweilers, Russell. You disgrace the name of republicanism, attacking the Belfast comrades.
I warned you, Ryan, we'll not let your communist mob take over. You can be off back to the north with them.
Shame on you, Russell. You're happier to tug your forelock to the bishops than you are to welcome the Protestant comrades.
Volunteer detail, raise your weapons.
The love of God, Russell, have you no shame?
Volunteer detail, prepare to fire. They'll not fire. They haven't got the ball. At them, lads.
And as they breathed life into it, I could reimagine all sorts of dramatic possibilities emerging in the context of their performances. And very often, the talented actors like Dara Devaney would come up with improvised lines which very quickly found their way embedded within the reworked script.
But Eamon de Valera's no Adolf Hitler and Sean Russell no Himmler. The Irish have no flair for fascism. Besides, we can never pull off that lovely salute you boys have.
Over the years, I've developed a very specific type of film practice which combines a number of different elements. Archive moving image, particularly drawn from the tradition of silent cinema, combining that with live action reconstruction, and combining that with voiceover, and particularly the voiceover, what could be described as the unreliable narrator. That's to say, somebody who narrates their own life story, and in narrating it raises in our mind always the question of how truthful or untruthful the account that we're actually hearing is. Now, with the Frank Ryan film, all those elements are still present. The use of the archive to tell in the sense of the historical context, the use of the live action to fill in for all those gaps in the archive, but to create a dramatic dynamic as well, and the use of the narration, in this case in the form of Frank Ryan narrating his own story into a tape recorder, with all the questions that raises about the reliability or the unreliability of the narration. What's different perhaps in the Frank Ryan film is that the dramatic element is given foregrounded more and given more prominence, but the use of the archive in relationship to the live dramatic action has a particular raison d'etre, which is to make people think both about the archive and also about the truth status of what they're seeing. Whereas a classic fictional film invites you to suspend your disbelief and enter into story structure and to identify with the characters, and in many ways to leave your criticism and rationality at the door of the cinema. A film like Frank Ryan hopefully gets the audience to question what they're seeing, of course questioning Ryan and his motives, but also questioning how the archive is used, also questioning how the reconstructions work and what the meaning of those reconstructions and what assumptions are being made by the filmmaker in terms of posing a certain type of reconstruction.
What are we to do about these IRA prisoners we've inherited? Our people want them released immediately.
That Frank Ryan's a troublemaker. You might live to regret this.
Frank Ryan is a headstrong young man, certainly, but genuine. Tell me, Mr. Gagan, have you ever been held in prison because of your political beliefs?
Not yet, Prime Minister.
Well, I have. Arrange for Frank Ryan's immediate release.
Of course, sir.
Dev had got us out of jail and there was great rejoicing. But with his election, the idea of the Republic was quietly buried. The IRA had supported his campaign, but now he didn't need us anymore. Politically, we were in the wilderness. But crafty old Dev had outflanked us.
Another question that often gets asked of a director is what filmmakers and what film traditions have influenced how you think about film, and particularly how you've constructed a film like the Enigma of Frank Ryan. I've been very influenced by a particular tradition of filmmaking, sometimes referred to as found footage filmmaking, sometimes referred to as an archive retrieval tradition of filmmaking. This is a filmmaking which very often filmmakers, very often schooled in traditions of the art school or in traditions of avant-garde film practice, rework bodies of archival film and create new stories with these. I'm thinking here of the work of a filmmaker like Bill Morrison, whose film Her Story was based on fragments from the Library of Congress early film collection, which were about to be thrown out into a skip that he rescued, and they makes a beautiful film celebrating the nature of the earliest of cinema. Or his film Decasia, which is a much more elaborate attempt to retrieve archival elements, what are sometimes called the orphan films, a film that no one knows who actually made them, and to rework them around storylines and give them new life and new creative meaning. Again, the Hungarian filmmaker Peter Fokas made a wonderful series of short films based on the German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, where he can't interview Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's long dead, but he takes one of Wittgenstein's greatest books, the Tractatus, and he cuts that against an archive of a family from Budapest in the 1920s and early 1930s that he discovers. There should be no relationship between these images and what we're hearing, the voiced narration of the philosopher, but extraordinary resonances occur between image and voiceover, and this is what Peter Fokas has particularly been brilliant at, taking domestic archive home movies and reworking them and reinscribing them, not treating them as evidence of anything, but expressive possibilities for a filmmaker to work through. The last filmmaker I would identify who's influenced me is Eduardo Kozarinsky, an Argentinian experimental filmmaker who works both in fiction and in found footage work, who made a wonderful film about the German officer Ernst Junger, who found himself stationed in Paris during the German occupation in the early 1940s. Junger produced a wonderful diary, and based on this diary, Kozarinsky made a film, One Man's War, which actually explored the thinking of Junger against the use of archives of Paris, newsreels of Paris during this particular period.
Puis les deux gardiens le mènent vers le frêne, le pasteur l'accompagne. Je voudrais détourner les yeux, mais je m'oblige à regarder. Et je saisis l'instant où, avec la salve, 5 petits trous noirs apparaissent sur le carton, comme s'il tombait des gouttes d'eau rosée.
Again, we're not quite sure how reliable or unreliable Ernst Junger in his diaries is as a narrator. Is he already perhaps anticipating the end of the war, the defeat of Nazism, and the necessity to re-establish himself as a figure outside the framework of that ideology? Or is he covering his tracks in various sorts of ways because he's worried about the possibility of his perceived disloyalty to the regime? We never know. Junger was a particularly strange character. But in this sort of work where you take a voiceover, you cut it against archive, and you produce something wonderful in interaction between the two.
Paris, 7 juin 1942. À midi chez Maxime, où j'étais invité par Paul Morand. Nous avons parlé, entre autres choses, des romans américains et anglais, notamment de Moby Dick et de Un cyclone à la Jamaïque. Puis de Barbe Bleue et de Landru, qui dans une banlieue de Paris a tué naguère 17 femmes. Dans la rue Royale, j'ai rencontré pour la première fois de ma vie l'étoile jaune, portée par 3 jeunes filles qui sont passées près de moi, bras dessus, bras dessous.
I certainly find great inspiration, and of course One Man's War, set as it is in the 1940s, has particular pertinence to how you might go about understanding the enigma that is Frank Ryan.